So I had prepared some stuff for today, but I wanted before we started to ask if there was anything that had come up from the previous two spaces that you wanted to address quickly here at the top before I started talking about adjacency, what is a minority report, how is it different from a conspiracy theory, and then sort of what people should do to make of these things in the meantime.
I didn't have any issues. I thought basically we kind of left it on a cliffhanger for me though, because I think this is a very interesting topic. I don't know if Mike Trisco has any thoughts from last time that he'd like to share. But I actually did have one thought about this topic that I think I wanted to introduce at the right moment. It's something that's come up in my mind over the past couple of years, several times. I think would be very interesting to get your thoughts on.
Yeah, let's go
Um,
ahead and start there. I'm going to let Mike up, but ask your question while he comes up.
sure. So, are you familiar with the concept of the alternative reality game, or ARG?
No.
Um, I'm just looking at Wikipedia's. Uh, it's got an article on alternative reality game, and the top line reads, an alternative reality game, or ARG, is an interactive networked narrative that uses the real world as a platform and employs transmedia storytelling to deliver a story that may be altered by players' ideas or actions. So when you think about it, an ARG is often introduced as like some kind of rabbit hole which people go down. They find various kinds of clues in YouTube videos, sometimes across various channels, sometimes well-established channels. They'll put something up which will kind of lead the people back into the story, and there's a deeper narrative. There's a particular YouTube channel I follow called I can't remember the name of the YouTube channel, but they reviewed one called DAD, D-A-D. It's just what the channel is called, and it's a very weird, surreal kind of channel, but it leads you down all kinds of rabbit holes of storytelling. And the thing that is clear to me about ARGs is that there are actually some extremely popular ones, and they're sometimes used as a form of viral marketing for games and other things like that. But the principles of ARGs, the idea that there is rabbit holes or trailheads, that there's a puppet master kind of behind the scenes spinning the narrative, that there's generally a curtain. This is the curtain drawn from the phrase "pay no attention" from behind the curtain. It's generally a metaphor for the separation between the puppet masters and the players. But the idea being that a lot of times these also feed back. So what the players do, the sort of repostings they do, and the myth they start to form around it, the puppet masters pay attention to that and then refeed that back into their storytelling. So they might confirm or disconfirm certain things that the players are posting about. But there's been a lot of examples of ARGs. And now the thought that is relevant to our conversation right now is it seems to me that a number of the so-called conspiracy theories or ideas that have been kind of popularized lately. Let's take this QAnon example. When I look at that, it has all the attributes of a ARG, except any kind of acknowledgement that it's an actual ARG. Now, and even the ARGs that are out there, often they don't call themselves ARGs. They're just they have the basic design principles of ARGs I'm looking at right now. Storytelling is archaeology. Instead of presenting a chronologically unified, coherent narrative, designers scatter pieces of the story across the internet and other media. A platformless narrative, stories are not bound to a single medium, but exist independently and use whatever media is available to make itself heard. Designing for the hive mind, it's designed for a huge number of followers who might be all playing off each other. A whisper is sometimes louder than a shout. This would be like, little cue, weird cue drops or whatever. And this is not a game aesthetic. ARGs themselves do not acknowledge that they are games. So the idea being that certain things aren't necessarily meant to be entertainment, but that can be constructed as ARG-like meme complexes and then put out there to actually distract people from more important things in life, to actually pollute their information diet, if you will, using the vernacular that we're developing here. So, it might be interesting for you to kind of maybe explore the ARG concept, and we can talk about more next time. But that's something that I've been thinking about a lot. Is that some of and I've had family members sucked into these things. So I feel like they go down these endless rabbit holes where there seems to be a lot of little things here and there scattered all over the place, and they seem to feel like they understand it deeply. But to my skepticism, they usually respond, "Well, you haven't done the homework," and I find myself just kind of in awe of how deep these rabbit holes go sometimes when I've looked at them. But I don't see any real connection back to reality in many ways. They seem to lead further and further away from reality. That's why they're called alternative reality games. But I think that not all these things are games. I think there's sometimes, actual kind of propaganda or distractions or something. So your thoughts?
Yeah, so my immediate response is I fail to see how this ARG, as you've described it, is just different from reality as we experience it, right? And
Well, I'm
I
talking
think
about
one of
something
the
that's actually being constructed deliberately.
right, but I would contend that players in the game that we call reality, to use the vernacular of the ARG, are behaving in exactly the same manner, right? And since so much of our collective social ecology is driven by social truth, then these things can occur. I think what's kind of fascinating is that the cost of information distribution is so inexpensive that it's economically feasible for there to be more than one game, one meta game going on at the same time, right? So like the game that we're all currently playing, which is the game of life, I mean, it's totally socially constructed. There are players, there's people behind the scenes manipulating information. None of that is really true. But I think what's interesting is sort of in the absence of a cost to distribute information, that now we have kind of a Cambrian explosion and these kind of games. And that to the extent that they exist, like QAnon, how are they co opted by intelligence community actors or other people who are trying to shift large portions of the population to believe? There was Lonely Girl was one of the original ARGs, or at least like a proto ARG as you've described it, and sort of that
Hmm.
phenomena on the internet, coming out of 4chan, coming out of some of these bulletin boards if you're a little bit older, or even Usenet itself, as sort of like there's these sort of parallel storylines that are occurring that may or may not intersect with the reality that everybody experiences. I mean, anytime that you watch a movie, right, like John Wick, okay, that's an alternative reality game for the characters that are playing that alternative reality. Then there's just tons and tons of that, right? Like all of our storytelling is to an extent like some version of that, where it's like Los Angeles present day, and then there's like a story that's kind of crazy, right? Or this is a story about the future or whatever. And so I think the thing that's interesting to me is that the costs to run one of these things has reduced to the point where they're sort of like spontaneously emerging. And the thing is that you could go to play one of these ARGs to get really good at creating them, and then just easily flip over to quote unquote the real world, and use the exact same strategies and tactics in order to better your position.
Hmm.
Well,
So
I would add
go
one
ahead.
thing. I mean, I think from a sense making perspective, my interest in this type of concept would be what, how can you tell the difference between something that's a constructed game versus reality? And I agree with your point, Michael, that the cost has come down, but at the same time, one of the aspects that I would think might make a difference is that if you look at something like QAnon, for example, one of the reasons that deceived a lot of people, I think, is that they it was constructed in a way where they were looking for all the information to come from that single source. That was the authoritative source for reality for those people within the context of that game. And um, I think the same is true for a lot of augmented reality games. As you said, Wolf, it would be you'd have sort of the puppet masters that were sort of guiding and deciding essentially what reality was. And I think the same thing can certainly be true with some kind of psychological operation, whether it's the government or an intel agency or whoever. But it is more costly because, in reality, the way I look at it, at least, and you can tell me if you think I'm wrong, it's more decentralized than that, right? Like you have lots of sources to go to that are not connected to each other, and
Except that
some
if
of
you
those
look at the
sources will agree with
Election
others, right?
Integrity Project and all of these political groups that have the word integrity in them that have shown up as
Mhm.
NGOs throughout Western civilization in the last 5 years, it's all the same group of people, right? And they're
Well,
sprinkling
I
they're
mean,
sprinkling stories across all the media channels, right? This is a grave
yeah,
threat to our democracy.
sure, but at the same time, there are other sources where you can find people who might disagree with that,
Right,
and
right.
or other
So
sources where you can look for what at least what you might think is objective information. And if all of them point in the same direction, then you're probably going to think, okay, this is
well,
reality,
okay.
right? And
Yeah.
obviously there are many situations where it won't, but I think at least you have that. It's more expensive to make everything go in one direction, right?
Here's the thing. Um, the way that we look at these, the way that we evaluate these things is not trying to understand whether they're objectively true. We evaluate them depending on their effect on us, which is related to where we
Hmm.
sit in the human social ecology. So, for example, if you sit in the human social ecology in Stalin's Russia, in the USSR, then you have to believe everything that that government is putting out. Otherwise, you go to concentration camp and you die, right? And so there is an extent to which groups of people, depending on how big the group is and how much energy they're willing to put into their story, their alternative reality game, if you will, they actually bend actual reality. And then reality as it's experienced for people inside that reality is the alternative reality. And the QAnon phenomena is a fantastic example of this, right? Where you have a situation where there's too much information. All of the traditional news media sources are, what they're saying doesn't line up with reality. And so then you get these people who gain legitimacy in their personal networks by being a Q follower, right? Like they gain status because they're able to uniquely discern the messages that are coming from across the internet, right? And that is in and of itself a self-reinforcing reality, and that's why that's part of the reason why one of the most dangerous things about our current environment is the fact that it's free to distribute information, because it means it's also free to distribute misinformation. And the degree to which people are going to be benefiting from misinformation is the degree to which they're going to be spreading it themselves. And you may not have a correction, if you will, back to reality for decades. And you saw that with
Yeah, one of the
bunches of these totalitarian regimes. And that's what John Robb is always talking
mhm.
about when he talks about the long night. Like that is a constructed social reality that's away from what we would consider to be objective reality, but it doesn't matter because the puppet masters, if you will, in the ARG framework have the ability to suppress dissent and keep the game going almost indefinitely.
Well, what the puppet masters have going for them in actual ARG, for anybody who's just come in, we're talking about alternative reality games. You can look that up on Wikipedia. I actually did posted a link on my Twitter channel. But they share a lot in common with what would otherwise be called conspiracy theories. That there seems to be some people who essentially have a narrative they want to push, and they start dropping things here and there. Now, maybe they have a lot of control over main media, maybe they don't. Maybe it's something very widespread, like things about that might be considered to be in favor of like big vaccine companies, or it might be something that's comes from seemingly from underneath society, like the QAnon stuff. But they share a lot in common with these very consciously constructive alternative reality games, which are rabbit holes designed for people to go down and entertain themselves by gathering and actually helping extend the narrative without even necessarily knowing they're playing a game. And so my initial observation was that these ARGs are you could construct an ARG but basically do it without the intention of being a game, but with it being the intention of shaping the public discourse. And I think this has happened several times. And so it sounds like in general, Mike, you agree that there's no. If you wanted to shape the public discourse, this would be a good strategy, is to basically construct an alternative reality.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, he's Mike.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't know which
Sorry.
Mike.
Yeah, I meant Michael Guimarin, but yeah, sorry, Mike Trisco.
No problem.
Just like mute everybody.
Yeah, there we go.
Take myself off. Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and I think this is actually a great segue into the topic that I wanted to talk about. So last time we talked about
sure, let's go for that.
Reality is only ever one adjacency away from the story about reality. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to explain some information density phenomena or shelling points in the information ecology to explain what the difference is between, say, a minority report and a conspiracy theory, and when they interact as being the same thing and when they're actually separate concepts and ideas, and that helps us to understand this idea of adjacency, right? So I think the first thing is when you consider yourself, you exist inside of a social ecology. And that social ecology, obviously, the way that we interact with the world is through our five senses. And so you are interacting with an information space, and that space has dimensionality to it. And depending on where you stand in the ecology, you might be in the sun or you might be in the shade. And I know that's like sort of overly basic. So let me give an example of a very easy to understand set of reports, two minority reports and an institutional report. And that will give you a sense of what I mean when I say there are different reports. And then you can understand the Schelling point that gets you to those reports. And then I can explain what it means when we say there's a conspiracy theory. Now, just as sort of a teaser for everybody, the first use of the word conspiracy theory comes from the JFK assassination, where people talking, saying that JFK being assassinated was a conspiracy theory. It's kind of funny because it's now come out some, let's say 60 plus years later, that perhaps JFK was in fact assassinated by the CIA. So it's kind of come full circle, in my opinion. But nevertheless, let me talk about sort of the difference between a minority report and an institutional report. And we're going to talk for a brief minute about, and is that okay, Wolf, if we talk about this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I'm fascinated. These sound like important concepts, and I want to distinguish them. Of course, I can't hear the words minority report without thinking about
Yeah,
the movie,
well,
but
that's
maybe
where
it's
I
even
like the
relevant.
movie, right? So first of all, okay, so the framework is we're going to talk about breakfast. And sorry for those of you who may have heard me talk about breakfast before. So when you talk to people about breakfast and you say, what is a healthy breakfast? Depending on where the person stands in the information ecology for what the words healthy and breakfast means, they will have a different response. And I've identified three different positions that people stand in, and there are sort of alternate positions that are close to those, but there are three primary ones, right? So the first position, which is a minority report, is that if you are not hungry, then it was a healthy breakfast. So a number of years ago, there's like a kind of apocryphal, kind of fun story about McDonald's doing an investigation into their milkshakes, and they were trying to understand who drinks them, when do they drink them, and why do they drink them. And it turned out that over half of the milkshakes were sold at breakfast time, and they were sold to single guys who were on their way to work in a trades job. And when they interviewed these guys about why they were ordering a milkshake as opposed to an Egg McMuffin or whatever, the information that came back was basically it required work to eat. So it felt like they were doing something. And they felt full at the end of the quote unquote meal, the milkshake. And so when they followed up on this, they're like, well, do you think this is healthy? And a good number of them said, yes, right? I'm not hungry. Therefore, I'm healthy. And what's interesting about this as a minority position for health is that it's been the position of everyone in human society prior to, let's say, the famine in the US in the 1920s, right? Or 1919, 1920, which is functionally, if you're not starving, you are healthy. And then there's another position which emerges, which is today's institutional report position, which is to add information about macronutrients and calories, macronutrients being grams protein, fat, and carbohydrates. And so the institutional report would say, okay, what is a healthy breakfast? Well, that's a breakfast where you get enough calories and the ratio of grams, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins is appropriate. And then, of course, there's arguments about sort of what the correct number of calories are and sort of what the correct distribution of macronutrient ratios are. But fundamentally, from the institutional perspective, you're not going to be hungry if you eat a balanced breakfast, right? And that is where most people in society fall. And then there's an additional report, which I call another minority report, which is if you go to people who've done a lot of studying about the human body and about circadian rhythms and just how we function, and you ask them what a healthy breakfast is, they'll tell you nothing is a healthy breakfast because they're on some kind of high fat, low carbohydrate diet, they're on some kind of omnivore, or excuse me, carnivore or ketogenic diet, or some diet where there's a component of time restricted feeding and then they don't eat breakfast. And what's weird about this minority report is that they would also respond that not being hungry is healthy, right? So they don't eat breakfast. That's a healthy breakfast to these people, and yet they're not hungry. And so, in a sense, in this particular distribution of reports, every single increase in information, and let's just say it's like a factor of 10. So if you have no information about health and you believe that eating and not being hungry, not starving is healthy, then you add in like 10 times as much information density, and now you get to, macronutrients and calories in versus calories out. Okay, great. Now you add in 10 times more effort and you get to, well, actually, you don't need to eat anything to be considered healthy. What's interesting is that they each contain the what is healthy of the previous version, right? Which is in all three that you're not hungry in the health case, right? And so when we talk about a minority report, it is a position in the social informational ecology that is differentiated from the institutional report, right? And one of the fundamentally like problems in our society is when people from different reports sort of yell at each other, like one report is better than the other, right? And there's tons of research in behavioral psychology that poor people make very efficient decisions with their money and time from their perspective, right? Even though if you go to, say, the institutional perspective on the decisions that the poor person is making, they are not efficient decisions, right? So that would be status goods signaling by buying really expensive purses and handbags and cars, and all the other things that they do is really from their perspective, right? And you can think about sort of the sanctimoniousness of somebody on one of these carnivore diets going to somebody who's a trades guy just trying to get a milkshake so he can go to work, saying, hey, that's not a healthy breakfast, right? It's like, fuck you. So anyway.
So yeah, well, so it seems to me that the kind of domains you're talking about, the domain of, say, a low information person who's just interested in satiety and not being hungry when they're going to work, and a person maybe from an institutional level who's trying to figure out, scientifically what the average human body needs. And of course, none of us are average, but then they promulgate these so-called standards, to somebody who's feels like they've gone down a particular rabbit hole and come up with a solution and tried it and it works for them, say like the carnivore diet, and then they become kind of like either an acolyte or priest of that diet. I'm not knocking the diet. I was actually carnivore for a whole year and enjoyed it. I'm still carnivore kind of adjacent, I would say. But it seems to me that I'm seeing what I feel more is more of a Venn diagram of overlaps rather than a
Yes,
hierarchy.
exactly.
So,
but like if you think of,
so can you
yeah, if
address
you
that?
think about the amount of energy required to go to each one of the positions, it's kind of like a salmon that jumps the waterfalls, okay? Because also when you transit from, being sated is healthy to eating a balanced breakfast is healthy to I'm a carnivore and therefore I don't need to eat a breakfast because I do time restricted feeding, people don't go back, right? So after you've spent the
Hmm.
effort to learn about circadian rhythms and hormones and all that stuff, and you have your sort of perfect for you diet, whatever that is, you don't suddenly go back to the position of the trades guy driving to McDonald's, having a milkshake, saying, what's healthy is whatever makes me not hungry, right? And so that is kind of a really interesting phenomena in that set of reports, right? So you have the minority report with the sated guy, the institutional report with, the government putting out the food pyramid saying this is what it means to be healthy, right? And then we can sort of argue about the efficacy of that and sort of the regulatory capture and blah, blah, blah. That's a whole separate thing altogether.
Hmm.
And then the minority report of the individuals who've spent the time looking at their specific chemistry and come up with, I think carnivore is the best diet, or I think high fat, low carbohydrate is the best.
Or for various reasons, veganism, on the
Right,
other hand,
right. And one, it's we don't
so.
really know the path of somebody's health, and so it's hard to say that veganism like unilaterally is unhealthy. Although, as somebody who's evaluating that report, I fail to see many people who are vegan who seem healthy across a whole variety of domains. And so for me, it's easier to dismiss that with sort of the, don't go to a dentist with bad teeth argument. Um,
Right.
but nevertheless, understanding that these people are going to stand at different places in the social informational ecology and have a different experience is really critical. Because when you talk about the breakfast example, it's sort of like it doesn't matter, but it really matters when you talk about, say, pro-choice versus pro-life. Because in the informational distribution between those two positions, they're not oppositional, right? They actually don't argue at cross purposes. And in psychology and debate, we call this switch tracking. So there's nobody who's actually like anti-choice, anti-death, which would nominally be the difference.
Right. Pro-death.
Or yeah, whatever it is, right? Like obviously there's a little bit of wordsmithing going on with these positions, but actually they're actually kind of different positions that require you to hold a different understanding about what the definitions are for that position. And if you accept the definitions of that position, then you can do nothing else but conclude that that is the correct position. And
well, rhetorically, they're both what would be called persuasive definitions. They are definitions that are not merely designed to inform, but also to
yes,
persuade.
but what the problem is that in our society, because so much is determined by sort of who holds the rod of power, that means that if you can get enough people to believe your reality, your definitions, you win. And that's why I believe that all of our discourse has fallen from what's the best way to evaluate between two positions, because we're trying to go from point A to point B, to just having a conversation about what is point A. And it's just, go ahead.
Is this basically, people having decided some time ago that 1984 was a user guide and not a warning?
I mean, that's kind of, so I feel like that's a little glib. It's kind of like the people.
It is glib. I totally admit it's glib, but I think there's
point. Like people that also say that, what's his name? Alinsky's Rules for Radicals is like a playbook. And I spoke to a number of people who worked on various political campaigns in the last 2 decades, and they talked about that. And while that may be true, right? Like, it's sort of, the thing is like, I look at it more like this. Is called the Terminator paradox or the Skynet paradox, which is when you have fiction, if you create enough fiction, then whatever you've said is going to be true at some level, right? It's kind of like you can take a really big work like the Bible or Moby Dick and apply an algorithm to it and can extract predictions about the future, right? Because the data set is so big. It's kind of like, and to put it in the financial world, is people back test their financial prediction models and it looks really, really good. And then they put it in the real world and they fail immediately. It's kind of the exact same thing, which is like overfitting your model when you're trying to.
Well, for example, Orwell said things like, "Who controls the past controls the present and the future." And Ibram X. Kendi said, the only solution to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only solution to present discrimination is future discrimination. I don't know if Kendi ever read Orwell. I presume he did. I hope he did. But these principles seem to actually be carried forward by a lot of people, that they feel that by constructing a reality, by constructing a narrative, and by speaking about it frequently as if it's the only possible way to view things, the only right thing that right thinking people can do, they entrain people into believing their version of reality.
And that's because for almost everything that matters in human society, it is a social truth. It's very, very difficult for people to understand that because they want to believe that they don't exist inside Stalinist Russia or Nazi Germany. Sorry to break Godwin's law. But you really don't know, right? Like the value of money is a social construction. Almost the fact that there are only two police on duty in my town of 30,000 at any given time. Okay. And there's almost no crime. That the only reason why that works is because people believe in a social construction, which is the rule of law and yada, 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 yada. The moment that they don't believe those things, it all reverts to something much worse. And what has happened, and I just talked to somebody else about this today, is that in the past, because it was expensive to distribute information, it was much easier to have and to disseminate a Newtonian construction of the world, a cause and effect. We're going to put out the Wall Street Journal every week. Everyone's going to read. And so we're going to have consensus on what reality is. And then we're going to have an argument about the best way to go to one reality or another. With free information, we've shifted from a Newtonian understanding of the world to a quantum understanding of the world, where you can understand your position or velocity, but not both. And so what has happened in the discourse is that we don't argue about the best way to go from A to B. We argue about what is A. And it's really important when you're evaluating minority reports and their efficacy on you that you understand that this is the format of the argument. Because then you can ask the question, is this my definition of a woman? And if the answer is no, then that position is nullified for you. And then you got to be really careful that you're not like me, living in an area where people have an alternate definition from you.
Mhm. So you said a moment ago that it's not the argument is not about going from A to B, but what is A? You know, uh, just on its face, that sounds like that's going backwards. Would you agree that that's the degradation of our discourse, or do you think that we should have been arguing about what is A all this time, and now we're just getting
No,
around
no,
to
no.
it?
It's not about what we should be doing. It's about what is possible, right? So human beings have a set of instincts and things that we do, okay? And you can go read our entire history to read what those things are. It doesn't really change. And if you think about from today to the invention of agriculture has only been like 400 generations. So if you believe in evolution and all this kind of thing, which I do, there's not enough time for there to be any real evolution, and yet the experience of the common person today is so radically different from 400 generations ago, right? And
Mhm.
so like it's not going backwards, it's that the cost of having these arguments is so much cheaper that we are now
Mhm.
having them, right? So like for example in the
So what would we consider luxury 200, 300 generations ago? And basically, unthinkable because your survival is necessary. Now we have the luxury of arguing about what is a woman or whatever.
Yeah, partially yes, but also like think about the media environment specifically, right? So let's say you're in 1955 or 1960, whatever it was. You have three television channels: ABC, CBS, and NBC. If you have a
Hmm.
story that doesn't meet the minimum bar of one of those three channels, it's like it doesn't exist.
Sure.
Whereas, and so what people would have to do is they would have to like print pamphlets in a basement in order to say like, hey, actually the government's lying about bread rations, okay, to use the Soviet example,
Hmm.
right? And then they would come up with a publication called Truth, and then there'd be like Counter Truth, and if you like that kind of thing, you should go study about it. It's really interesting. And then like we're worried about NBC, CBS, and ABC, so we created a culture of objective truth telling, right? Which was basically like, okay, we're going to give you a Pulitzer Prize for generalizing a story the best of anybody else, when in fact you're still like taking out real details from the story and you're still setting a bar about what is real, in terms of what's going to enter the media environment. And as you add news channels, then in order for the news channels to differentiate, they have to either become more partisan, which is what they've done in the last 20 years, because there's an infinite number of news channels, or they have to present greater and greater like salient stories to a smaller group of people, which you could say is a kind of partisanness, but I look at it as different, right? Which is you have to become a lot more specific. Niche down is the e-commerce term in the news in order for people to pay, right? Because like the example is, the New York Times, they print, all the news that's fit to print. Okay. The internet comes out and
Hmm.
there's a guy named Bob and Wolf. We were there. I know you, you know me. We were there when this happened. Literally, there's a guy on the East Coast who gets his newspaper at 6 a.m. from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and he rewrites the articles at 6 in the morning from the physical newspaper into his website and then charges people less money than the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. And it's the exact same information. Okay. And at the
Hmm.
periphery of that business model, people are going to be like, wait, why am I going to the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal and paying $30 a month when I can just pay Bob $5 a month or $10 a month and it's the same exact information? And then there were a million Bobs. Okay. Right. And
Right.
so what happened as a result is that you went from having there's 100 facts about the world and everybody writes about the same 30, and then we give awards to people that write about the 30 in the best way, to now you can write about any of the 100 facts, and oh by the way, there's now 1,000 facts and 900 of them are actually false, and there's no way to actually tell.
This is actually going to get worse too, because, for example, and I'm a huge proponent of technology. I'm a technologist, and I think that AI is very exciting. But I've done enough experimentation with GPT-3 that to know that you can just take all the content of the New York Times on one given day, article by article, tell GPT-3 to summarize it, and then repost that on your blog. And they won't be able to tell that you did that. You're doing essentially the same kind of rewriting you were just talking about, but you can also tell it to slant it from your point of view.
Correct. And the thing is, yes, what
and it will just do
what
it.
happens?
Yeah.
Right. That is
You can say
100%
summarize the following article from a particular political perspective, and it will. It'll rewrite the article or summarize it, shorten it, whatever you want. But and it'll include the gist of the article, but also include your slant.
That's correct.
And this is cheap now,
Yes.
So
right. And whichever one does the most confirmation bias or gets people to feel the most so that they click on the ads. Remember, the pattern is bad story, bad story, bad story, good story, commercial break. Then that is the one that will come to dominate in the media environment. But that's not actually what's going to happen. I mean, that will happen, but it's not going to be very long lived, because you and me and Mike and Adam and Chance and Justin and Woke, we all have to still come to some agreement about reality, right?
Right.
So you're going to see the emergence of curators where they hold a consistent position on topics through time, and people can count on them to hold that position on topics through time. And it doesn't really matter if they're right or not. It just matters that the curator is giving them information that is lining up. Now we're a little bit, go ahead.
As you know, I mean, I have a generally libertarian perspective, and that's not going to change. That's started for me maybe 20 years ago, and when I really thought about it and came, reasoned from first principles my own way and came to those conclusions. And I think that whatever stories I'm faced with, I want to know the truth. I'll go dig deep, but obviously that's. If you ask my opinion on a story, I'm going to come back to you from that.
Well, now wait a minute, Wolf,
and be open about it. Yes,
this is what's really interesting. You say you're going to go dig deep, and we talked about alternative reality games. So, quick history lesson. One of the most difficult problems in web search is crawling the internet. And the reason why crawling the internet is a big problem is because there are evil people who want to make money. And so they create websites that, as the crawler is searching them, programmatically create content, an infinite amount of content. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so this is like, you are a libertarian, you're going to go out in the world and you're going to look, and the AIs that surround your media environment are going to infinitely create whatever it is that you want to see.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, that is a real hazard. I agree. And of course, what you also said a moment ago, it isn't going to happen that way, because, and when you think about it, we are in a sense like neurons in a larger network of brains. We are connected to certain sources, which are themselves curators of information, and that we value because they seem to have a high correspondence with either maybe our confirmation biases or maybe what we consider to be reality. But then we digest those and pass those on, and we have to deal with conflicting information somehow, either by dropping on the floor or incorporating it, having kind of a moment of aporia, of knowing confusion, and then resolving that somehow by changing our beliefs, and I think that's how society is supposed to function. Is we're all helping curate reality for each other.
And this is exactly why our world is going to start looking socially more like a hunter-gatherer society than an agricultural or an industrial society, because the limit of this is that the only thing that you have is the trust in the 150 people or so that you can actually verify. And so one of the biggest problems on the internet today is what I call the reputation problem, which is you vouch for somebody, Wolf, and then that person vouches for somebody. But how do I know that that person is any good? And there are certain areas like, my plumber getting certified by the state of California, where I'm kind of like, yeah, he's probably 99% accurate. But then you read these stories where these certifying authorities get regulatory capture. And in the limit, this happens to everybody, right? And so at the point where anybody can create an AI that generates an infinite amount of information on any topic, then the only thing that you can really do is meet people in real life and say, like, okay, Wolf really is a person, and he is really having the results that I want. Like, I see him physically healthy, right? You and I have met each other. I see that he drives a car that is similar to the kind of car that I see. I know that you have a spouse. I have a spouse. He has the kind of spousal relationship that I want. Right. And so, like, that is actually what's going to happen, because there's no, like, we talked about this with Syria. So I was doing a lot of like information work on what was happening in Syria. I've always been fascinated by ISIS and the rise thereof and sort of the information environment. And it got to be a point where there is like no way to tell with when the quote unquote chemical attacks were happening, what was actually real on the ground in Syria, right? So we were well primed for this Ukraine conflict to be like, well, we don't really know anything about anything because everything is just totally constructed, and there's no way to actually check unless you physically know a Wolf McNally on the ground in Syria. And Wolf's like, yes, Michael, you and I have met 100 times in real life. I'm literally looking at a bombed out shelter, right? And then of course you get the, well, you're wearing AR glasses, so are you really looking at
Right.
bombed out shelter? But that is where we go. But I think we're not going to get there for a little bit, like a couple of decades. And in the meantime, when you're evaluating different reports, just to keep repeating it, you have to look at the results that the person is getting, right? And do they line up with the results that you want? Are they balancing authority and responsibility? Okay, so there's an infinite number of people that I can get fitness advice from. I am a man. I look like a man. I am not going to get fitness advice from a woman because that is not me, right? I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to see a jacked guy and be like, how are you like this? Okay, I'm going to follow that guy because I can verify personally that he has the results of the system that he's pushing, right? And at some level, maybe he's lying, but whatever. You can tell after a while. This is the pattern that it's going to have to repeat for everything in your life. And the most interesting thing, I think, from a Minority Report perspective is what happened with COVID. And I'll explain very briefly, which is for a long time, I've been doing this information stuff. And so I've come across a lot of guys that invest a lot of money via hedge funds and other institutions. So let's say billions of dollars. And previous to COVID, it was inconceivable to these guys that the CDC would actually lie about the pandemic, right? Or misrepresent the truth. And so then we realized, like, this was like a big realization, I guess, for, let's call it $50 billion in capital, which was there was no institution that was now ahead of the truth. And so then these guys just spent a huge amount of money building their own sense-making networks all over the world, right? And that shift, I think, is really profound from, like this idea that there are institutions which are going to give us the information that they're going to have to I'm 100% fully responsible for everything. And I literally cannot even trust, the CDC in the middle of a pandemic to give information that's accurate, that's going to allow me to trade in the market, right? And these are capital allocators, so they give zero shits about, all of the things that people talk about. They care about what's real. And for them to ask the question like, okay, these institutions, I can't trust them anymore, that is a big deal, right? And I always think, okay, what are the wealthiest people in the world doing? That's what I'm going to be doing in a few years. And so like when they're basically saying you have to be responsible for evaluating every single thing yourself, understanding that any source that you have has a bias, right? And so that's why we did all that bias training around identifying, which intelligence community was running Zero Hedge and a number of the other sort of like major aggregators that have emerged, right, in the decentralized anonymous space. That is something that you're going to have to do. Anyway, we have 10 minutes left. Questions?
Just a couple of quick thoughts. For me, finding out who you want to, connect with in your sense-making network. We talked about sense-making masterminds, I think in our first conversation a couple weeks ago. I think that you're kind of echoing that now, that you need to decide who you're going to be connected to make sense of the world, and picking people who I would say have integrity. And what I mean by integrity is they're telling a single story. They're not, all over the place. I have a video on my channel. I'll plug that right now, which is youtube.com/@Beware of Wolf podcast. It's called What is Integrity? And where I actually tell the story about how I was married for 15 years, my first wife, and I cheated. So I have a story about that. And I say in that podcast, if you learned all the stories about my life, I'm very proud of the fact that, if everybody got together after I died and compared notes, they would say that, Wolf told the same story. You all heard different parts of the same story, but you wouldn't find gross contradictions in the story because, and for instance, like you and my affair, I eventually confessed that to my now ex-wife because I couldn't stand being out of integrity with myself, living a lie. And it seems to me that you need to find people who, they're not grossly contradicting themselves or denying they ever said what they said. They have to have an integrous kind of personality, and so that you can basically know that that you can, even if you don't agree with them, you can at least trust them, that they're not just feeding you bullshit, that they're really giving you their
No, I love
their
people
honest
that are
perspective.
feeding me bullshit. I love it because then I get to see like what they're doing. Like I
Oh,
love
you need those people
that
too,
guy
though,
Malcolm
obviously.
Nance is freaking great. Okay, it's freaking great.
I'm not denying that you need people, you need to see what the bullshit is, but you also sometimes we need help recognizing what bullshit is. Yeah, so since we're about 10 minutes out from our ending time, I want to invite anybody else who wants to speak on these topics or anything adjacent. We were talking about adjacent to realities. Please just raise your hand or request the microphone, and be happy to let you talk about that. Michael, do you want to quickly mention where you can also be found? So before we get all the way to the end.
Yes, so I am working diligently. My long-suffering wife and I have made a quick reference guide to help people on info detox. And so I'm going to be releasing that through my Twitter here in a couple of weeks. I'm pretty proud of that.
Great.
So instead of
So if you're not,
$5,000 and going crazy with my class, you can just pay $10 or whatever the price is going to be and get like a really nice thing in the mail. So
awesome. Yeah, and my deal is flyinglogic.com, which is a critical thinking tool used all around the world. And I'm also working on kind of a deep course curriculum on that too, that will hope coming out in the next few months that teaches you how to use the software and how to think with the software to improve your life in various systems. So I think Mike would like to say something. Mike Driscoll.
Yeah, I think my question on this topic is, when you come across something that might be a conspiracy theory or a rabbit hole, what are your suggestions for how you navigate that to understand whether you should think it's true or not?
the bigger it is, the less likely that the conspiracy or rabbit hole is more than one story away from reality.
More
Right.
than one story, meaning more than one adjacency, meaning less likely to be in any sense objectively true.
Right, exactly, right? So like people get really deep into the JFK conspiracy theory and they're like it's the CIA and it's all these different things. It's pretty clear at this point that it's the CIA, right? It wasn't this crazy mafia like Russians colluding, blah blah blah. Like you can read sort of some infinite depth things. He's just like, yeah, it was the CIA, right? It's only one adjacency away. Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, they said there were weapons, there were no weapons. That's it.
Yeah,
Like,
you hear things about the false flagging on 9/11, supposedly, or we never went to the moon, things like that, and you think, how big would these conspiracies have to be to actually sustain them, and for the truth to never have emerged?
right,
And
but then
I've
you
spoken
also
with some
look at
people who.
like the Lusitania, and we didn't find out for over 100 years or 90
Mm-hmm,
years on the Lusitania,
mm-hmm.
right? So I agree with you there, but like on the moon thing, it's very easy for anybody to go, very easy, haha, go to like a astronomy place and you can actually shoot a laser off the moon and measure it yourself, right?
Sure,
It's a
and reflect
very,
off the
very
mirror that
cool
we placed
thing.
there.
Yeah, so we placed a reflector on the moon. Anybody can hit it with a laser, and then you can use basically a telescope to pick up the light and confirm that one yourself. It's actually like very cool if you have kids.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like I said, I think it's one adjacency. So on 9/11, there's a lot of things that don't add up about 9/11, but
Mm-hmm.
there's nothing that is only one adjacency from the story as we're told, right? That really makes any sense. And so for me, because that's true, I do believe that like straight up there were 19 guys who drove planes into the World Trade Center, and
Mm-hmm.
all of those people actually died in those planes. They weren't like a secret plane on the runway, and
It's
etc.
interesting because your kind of model that you're focusing on, which I think is a great model, is adjacencies. And the way I've modeled it in my own mind is that the smaller conspiracy is, the more stable it is, because the less likely it is there will be leakers. Whereas the larger conspiracy gets, the less likely it is to be sustainable. And when you get these kind of global things, like even the World Economic Forum, some people want to say, well, it's a conspiracy, but they're all in the open. Basically, they're telling us what they want to do. The question is, are we going to go
That
along
is
with it
what's
or not?
so amazing about it, right? And like everybody's pointed out that these guys are kind of like posers. You're like, this is so weird. That anyway. So
Right. No,
yeah,
but the thing
that's
is,
not a conspiracy.
I think ultimately it's going to be, well, here's the other kind of not really corollary, but it goes hand in hand with it, is it doesn't take a lot of people to shift the societal perspective on a major topic. I mean, if you take, say, for example, gay marriage, it didn't take 100% or even anywhere nearly a majority of people to decide that it was time to legalize that. Whether you agree with it or not, separate issue. But the fact is, a relatively small minority, I'd say between 10 and 25% of people decided it was the way to go. But they were opinionated enough and vociferous enough that they basically tipped the balance of society over that particular tipping point. And so it doesn't take, if you're upset about the way things are going, at least take solace in the fact that you're not going to have to convince everybody that you're right. Just convince the right people, and enough of them, and you can actually change society.
Yeah, to your point about that, we did an after action on the 2020 election and the Election Integrity Project. There were 4 people who basically were able to construct the narrative around the election was secure. And then Time Magazine came out with the election was fortified discussion. But it was only 4 original people who had that idea. They were just really well placed. And I just thought that was the most amazing thing, that we were able to move on from that event so quickly without really looking at what these people had admitted in that Time article. And it was because of basically 4 people. All right, Chance, I think you had your hand
Yes,
up.
Chance wanted to speak, I think.
Yeah, so just quickly, it goes back to our conversation before, Michael, about sort of a denial of service attack by occupying space via concordance, or otherwise, like you can test your adjacencies by offering opportunities for concordance in action. And as that opportunity is taken, that concordance in action creates alliances which would otherwise not exist, and moves people closer to you and to your story because they accepted your invitation into the action. And that's kind of all I was thinking and wanted your thoughts on.
Yes.
Can you provide maybe a more concrete example that you're thinking
Yeah.
about,
So
Chance?
can I summarize?
Or yeah,
Chance?
or
Is that
Mike.
okay.
Mhm.
So what Chance, correct me if I'm wrong, is talking about is this idea that if you're having a conversation for somebody that you disagree with for hours and hours and hours on end, you're kind of like doing a denial of service on their attention and effort placed towards something that you don't care about. And the next level up about this is to find the common ground with that person and spend all of the collective time and energy that you work with them on it on that common ground. And as a result of them being on that common ground, they're spending less attention and effort and energy on the areas where you don't have common ground. And so this is a way to co-opt people into sort of your way of thinking. And if you go back and watch the podcast that Chance and I did, it was all about how Chance likes to garden with the people in his immediate environment because there's a lot of great reasons for gardening, and it's something that he really cares about. And if they're gardening, then they're not doing all the other things that he may disagree with his neighbors about. And I think this is like really kind of the most amazing thing, because in a world where you shift from consensus of the institution, which is where opting out is difficult, so you can't opt out of the IRS, for example, without giving up your US citizenship, to a world where opting in is difficult, which would be a decentralized network. And opt in is really how to gain power in a decentralized network. Well, you need a lot of authenticity, which means that you have to come with a lot of receipts, which makes opting in more difficult, whereas opting out is very difficult. So, anyway, in that world, that information decentralized world, denying a service people by focusing on the things that unite you versus not, is the right sort of like game theoretic position for moving people, because again, it's just about occupying their time, which is why again you see in the information environment more broadly these narratives will emerge to try and um, either split people's attention or get them really excited about a story that doesn't matter, right? And you just saw this whole conservative movement in the US, I think completely derailed by this Crowder Daily Wire thing. That was a really bizarre story as an outside observer of the information space, because all of these people, instead of focusing on, signing people up to vote or whatever, they were focused on this sort of weird internal battle. And I think it's more insidious than everyone who follows Jordan Peterson is not told like, hey, go vote. These are the positions. This is a policymaker that I agree with, blah, blah, blah. It's all like, buy my merch, which a number of people say. So I find that super weird. But this thing that happened in the conservative movement where they were talking about this $50 million, this or that, that was like really bizarre to me, right? Anyway, so
it's
Chance,
a very weird moment of inside baseball. I wish they'd resolved it, quietly, and I think they probably could have. But now, these things that kind of burst onto the scene, and I keep coming back to QAnon because I think it's the best example, kind of recapitulate the opening of an alternative reality game that split people who should be more unified, because it attracted a lot of attention from, and I'm not a conservative, I'm a libertarian, but a lot of people who should have shared common cause were instead split along lines that don't matter, but they were split nonetheless, and it created a lot of confusion.
Well, and they were accelerated down the wrong path. It's kind of like during the 2020 election, that guy, Sidney Powell, maybe wasn't a guy, was talking about Dominion and these crazy raids in Germany, right? Yep. And the real story was all of the, nursing homes in Wisconsin where they were showing 100% voting participation, where the average age is 85, right? Like that was the real story, which is the vote dumping story, not like some insane Brazil whatever. And sorry to get into the really inside baseball weeds there, but like I think these are sort of, and if you follow John Robb and Joshua Steinman, who are both good friends, they talk a lot about these kind of psychological influence operations that we're now seeing. The one that I'm seeing, which is totally crazy, is that there are human intelligence operatives who are both working for intelligence agencies, but also working for private enterprise, who have now appeared almost overnight in the Twitter sphere to completely derail things. And it's not just Eugene Go and Michael Schellenberger, who both have a history of getting money from various groups to push a very particular agenda. There are so many people that are showing up, and I'm kind of like, who is this person? Where are they coming from? That is sort of, in my mind, the most evolved thing that's happening. I guess now that censorship on Twitter is more difficult, now we're seeing more human intelligence ops. And I guess that is 3 minutes over. So I thank you guys for listening for 60 minutes. Wolf,
and just one final announcement. These conversations with myself, Michael, and anyone else who's joining will start to appear very quickly on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/@BewareOfWolf podcast. So please subscribe, and you'll be able to review these conversations very easily without doing it on Twitter. So we're going to do this again next week, I hope.
Yes, next week I'll prepare another conversation, and then the other thing is I've invented a technology that allows us to take these conversations and then convert them into blog posts and tweet threads using AI, and it doesn't work 100%, but it's very cool, and I want to actually make something so that you can also clip like a couple of minutes at a time with these things, but we're not there yet. Anyway, thank you all for joining, and we'll see you again next week.